Welcome back to the Weekly Education Pulse. I'm Sammy.
And I'm Tony.
This week marks the 1-year anniversary of starting the Weekly Education Pulse. So we're going to do something a little bit different. We're spending the full episode on one topic. A topic that shapes almost everything we cover on this show, but one we have not really stepped back to examine properly.
Is funding private education? Where is the money actually coming from? And does the source of that capital shape what happens inside a school?
Yeah, because when people discuss international schools today, they often jump straight into private equity. But the reality is far more complicated than that. Private education has always been shaped by whoever funds it: religious institutions, philanthropists, families, governments, corporations, and investors.
And each of those funding models brings different incentives, different time horizons, and different ideas about what education is actually for.
So to understand where the sector is heading, we probably need to understand how we got here in the first place.
Exactly, because the capital behind education has never been neutral. It has always shaped the system itself.
So Tony, where do we even start?
Well, let's go back to the emergence of formal schooling itself, at least in the form that we'd recognise today, because it didn't begin with investors and entrepreneurs. It began largely with religion, community obligation, and philanthropy.
Yeah, in fact, in Scotland in 1496, Parliament passed the Education Act, one of the earliest laws anywhere in the world requiring formal education. Then in 1616, the Privy Council mandated a church-supervised school in every parish. And then by 1696, local landowners were effectively taxed to fund schoolmasters across the country.
This model repeated itself across Europe after the Protestant Reformation. Lutheran churches across Germany and Scandinavia built parish school systems because they believed literacy and education were essential to civic and religious life.
Yeah, Catholic missionary networks did the same thing globally. The Jesuits built some of the most academically respected school systems in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and their objective was not financial return. It was mission, influence, education, and community formation.
And these systems were often incredibly sophisticated. Long before modern school groups existed, these networks operated across multiple countries with shared standards, governance structures, and education philosophy.
Yeah, the same pattern continued in other traditions as well. The Aga Khan Development Network operates hundreds of schools across South Asia, Central Asia, and East Africa, often in communities where commercial operators would never realistically invest.
It's important because it reminds us that for most of history, education was not viewed primarily as a financial asset. The return was social, religious, civic, or developmental.
And alongside religious institutions, wealthy benefactors and families also founded schools.
While many eventually became fee-charging institutions, the original logic was still largely mission-driven. Education was viewed as part of nation building, leadership formation, and public responsibility.
Yeah, then over the 19th and 20th centuries, independent schools increasingly shifted towards fee-funded models, families paying directly for the type of education they wanted for their children.
But even then, most schools still operated really relatively slowly. Expansion was cautious. Capital projects happened over decades. Governance was usually local. Most schools were not thinking of like scalable businesses.
And for much of the 20th century, that model broadly held.
Until globalization changed those economics completely.
Yeah, because the 1990s and 2000s, a rapidly growing middle and upper class across Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Latin America suddenly wanted access to international education at a scale that traditional model simply could not support.
Demand accelerated faster than most schools could expand, and that's really the moment institution capital started paying serious attention.
And in the past 2 decades, the funding landscape of private education has fundamentally changed.
International education is no longer a collection of independent schools funded by fees and occasional donations. It has become an investable global asset class, attracting some of the largest pools of capital in the world.
Yeah, we can be a bit specific about the scale here. EQT-led consortium acquired Nord Anglia, back in 2024 for $14.5 billion. That's one of the largest education transactions in history. Brookfield has invested into GEMS Education, KKR entered XCL Education in Southeast Asia, Hill House Capital acquired Dulwich College International's Asia Schools.
In April 2025, Abu Dhabi's Sovereign Wealth Fund announced a $600 million minority stake in Nord Anglia. So that consortium already concluded Dubai Holding, Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board, and Neuberg Bergman.
Yeah, which means that inside one international school group, you now have private equity, sovereign wealth, pension capital, and state investment vehicles all sitting at the same table.
And that is happening because the sector has characteristics investors find attractive: long-term demographic growth, rising household wealth, global mobility, strong parental demand, recurring fee income, and relative resilience during economic downturns.
But it's also important to acknowledge something else clearly. Large parts of the international school sector were historically undercapitalized.
Well, absolutely. Many schools were educationally strong but operationally fragile, founder dependent, limited in scale, weak systems, limited access for growth capital, inconsistent governance. Some simply just did not have the resources to invest in facilities, in safeguarding systems, in staff development, or in technology infrastructure.
And institutional investment changed a lot of that, particularly private equity.
Your private equity-backed groups have funded new campuses, expanded access to international education, professionalized governance structures, improved operational systems, and built leadership and teacher pipelines across multiple countries.
Yeah, many standalone schools simply could not have scaled at that pace independently.
But the concerns people raise about private equity are also legitimate. Education is fundamentally a long duration activity. Student outcomes, school culture, reputation, and trust compound over years and decades. Some investment structures align naturally with that time frame. Others operate on much shorter time cycles.
Yeah, and this is where the conversation often becomes too simplistic, because private equity is not one thing.
Absolutely. Some firms operate with genuine long-term perspectives and reinvest heavily into education quality and expansion. Others may pursue more aggressive optimization strategies like a shorter hold period and defined exit timelines.
Yeah, and when people talk about risk in investor-owned education, it's usually not about schools suddenly collapsing overnight.
No, it's much more subtle. Slower reinvestment, reduced innovation, pressure on staffing structures, professional development budgets just becoming a little bit tighter, specialist support roles becoming harder to justify financially.
But we should also be honest that those risks are not unique to private equity-backed schools.
Not at all. Some independent schools with no institutional ownership also slowly underinvest while relying heavily on historic reputation. Weak governance, poor succession planning, and operation complacency exist in non-investor owned schools too.
Yeah, which is why the more important distinction may not actually be private equity versus non-private equity.
It may be short horizon versus long horizon thinking. The core question is whether ownership structures support sustained reinvestment into educational quality over time.
Yeah, and from the outside, the sector often struggles to tell the difference between operators genuinely investing for long-term educational outcomes and those primarily managing towards financial events.
Transparency gap is probably one of the biggest issues the sector still has.
But private equity is only one part of a much larger investment picture. Sovereign wealth funds are becoming increasingly important players in international education.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund investment in Nord Anglia is probably one of the clearest recent examples. But sovereign wealth investment is usually connected to a much broader, national strategy.
Yeah, economic diversification, human capital development, international competitiveness, talent attraction, soft power.
Education becomes part of national infrastructure and long-term economic positioning.
And in many ways, that longer investment horizon can align very well with educational quality. If a country wants to attract international talent and highly skilled professionals, it needs genuinely strong schools over decades, not just financially efficient schools over a 5-year period.
But sovereign wealth also creates its own tensions. Long-term capital is not automatically neutral capital.
Yeah, there may be political sensitivities, national branding objectives, question around influence on educational independence, potential curriculum pressure. These are all legitimate conversations too.
Then there's another category that often receives less attention: family and conglomerate capital.
Yeah, and we've covered multiple examples of this recently, well, across Asia and here in Thailand in particular, with Siam Motors Group backing Highgate in Chonburi, BTS Group backing Wickham Abbey here in Bangkok, Country Group Development backing St. Paul's Girls' School, again here in Bangkok, and also the Sunshine Group backing Cranley across Vietnam.
In many of these cases, the schools form part of a broader long-term community or city building strategy.
Yeah, which can create very strong alignment. There's long-term patience there, deep local knowledge, and significant capital commitment. The integration into residential and economic development plans.
Again, no ownership structure is automatically perfect. Family-backed structures can also face governance concentration, succession challenges, prestige-driven decision-making, or situations where educational priorities become intertwined with broader commercial objectives.
Yeah, which is why the strongest school partnerships are usually the ones where educational philosophy, governance quality, operational expertise, and capital horizon are genuinely aligned.
Not just financially aligned, but educationally aligned.
So, where does all of this leave us?
Private equity, sovereign wealth funds, pension capital, religious networks, family conglomerates, charitable foundations, governments, all shaping private education in different ways.
And the honest answer is, well, that none of these sources of capital is inherently good or bad for education.
Strong schools can exist under almost any ownership structure. Weak incentives can also exist under almost any ownership structure.
And we come back to that point we made. What matters is alignment. What are the objectives of the capital? What is the investment horizon? What governance protection exists for school leaders? Is the school continuing to reinvest in teaching quality, staff development, student support, and innovation?
The world schools are preparing students for is changing incredibly quickly. Technology, AI, labor markets, demographics, cognitive science. The expectations placed on schools today are very different than even 20 years ago.
And schools that stop reinvesting eventually start living on accumulated reputation.
It's not just an investor-owned school problem. It can happen anywhere.
Yeah, capital that supports long-term educational improvement can strengthen schools enormously.
Capital that slowly consumes reputation without reinvesting in the substance behind it ultimately weakens the institution, regardless of whether that money comes from private equity, sovereign wealth, family offices, or traditional independent governance.
And, well, that's probably the central issue. It's not who owns schools, but whether the structures around ownership genuinely protect educational quality over time.
Because from Paris schoolmaster in the 17th century Scotland, funding by a local landowner, to sovereign wealth funds investing hundreds of millions into global school networks, the money behind education has always shaped what education becomes.
And today that question matters more than ever.
Share your perspectives in the comments. This is a conversation the sector needs to have more openly and more honestly.
And if there's a development in your region we should be covering, well, please do get in touch.
We'll be back next week with another global update.
Till then, see you next time.